Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. And we'd like to give a special welcome to C-SPAN's Book TV. We're here at the William K. Sanford Town Library in Colonie, New York. If you know where Albany is, we're right next door. So today we're going to hear from David Pietrusza. His new book is called 1960, LBJ versus JFK versus Nixon, the epic campaign that forged three presidencies. So here's Mr. Pietrusza.
Thank you. Glad to be here in Colonie on this rather crisp January day. There's an old saying that no matter how popular you are, the size of your funeral is going to depend on the weather. So I'm so glad to see so many of you with the temperatures hovering around -8 outside as a low. 1960, three presidents, three very different personalities, three ambitions, all ultimately for the same office, the White House, the presidency, the leadership of the free world, as they used to term it back then. But the ambitions are vastly different. John F. Kennedy, his is an ambition of a dynasty, in some sense a political dynasty, also a financial dynasty. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, had wanted to be the first Catholic president of the United States of America. His ambitions get derailed around 1940 as he picks the wrong side of the isolationist debate going into World War II. And he transfers those ambitions to his son, Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., who in August 1944, in an effort to equal his younger brother JFK's wartime exploits on PT-109, is piloting a bomber across the English Channel filled with one of the, perhaps the greatest load of TNT in the history of mankind. And somewhere across the English Channel, that plane blows to bits. They never find a piece of him. Windows are shattered in buildings in London. The explosion is so severe. And that is the end of that part of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s plan for the presidency. Those ambitions are transferred to John F. Kennedy Jr., who up until this point never saw himself as a politician, saw himself as a writer, a historian, a journalist perhaps, not quite sure what he was going to be, a bit of the dreamer. But when Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., old Joe, wants you to do something, his sons do it. And in 1946, he runs for Congress. And by 1960, the ambition, which was not his for the presidency, is. He's ready to run. Lyndon Baines Johnson belongs to a different sort of dynasty, a different sort of ambition. His family was a dynasty on the way down. His family had owned land and owned slaves in Texas and in the American South. And his father, Sam Johnson, had been a member of the Texas state legislature. But he works his way down on the social and political scale. When he's in the legislature, Sam Johnson sponsors a bill to have a road constructed near their hometown. And by the time that road is to be constructed, Sam Johnson is not only a former member of the state legislature, he's working on the road crew, doing manual labor, hauling dirt on his back, pushing wheelbarrows. That's how far the Johnson family had fallen so very, very quickly in Lyndon Johnson's youth. And Lyndon Johnson, sort of like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, well, Lyndon doesn't promise never to go hungry again. He promises never to be the idealistic fool his father had been, who had played a promising political career into working on that road crew. And Lyndon vowed he was going to succeed, and he was going to succeed not only in the most nefarious of ways politically, but also that he would let everyone know how clever and nefarious he was. He works himself up from congressional aide to congressman to United States senator. In 1948, he's elected to the U.S. Senate by 87 votes. And those 87 votes are highly fraudulent. They know him as Landslide Lyndon for the rest of his life, even after he's achieved a very great landslide of his own in 1964. But he then becomes Senate Majority Leader and makes that into a position of great responsibility and power. Unprecedented, really. He's the number 2 most powerful person in the country in the 1950s. And he wants to be president in 1960 a lot. The third ambition is of Richard Milhous Nixon's. And as his story begins, the ambitions are very small compared to JFK and to LBJ. He's just a typical American. There's no dynasty there. His family isn't going up or down. His father had been a streetcar conductor in Ohio who moved to California to get away from the cold and the frostbite he achieved on those very cold, unheated trolley cars up north. Richard Nixon goes to school. He does well. He's a great student. He's a musician. He excels in debating in high school and at Duke University. He wants to be an FBI man. Gets accepted, but then they say, no, actually, we changed our mind. You can't be that. He ends up as assistant corporation counsel or city attorney for the city of Whittier, California, and that appears to be as far as he's going until World War II, when he, like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, enrolls in the Navy. He comes out, and 1946 is a great year for veterans running for office, young, ambitious, intelligent, energetic veterans. So he runs in 1946, is elected to Congress in a very rough campaign, and stumbles into what history now knows as the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss had been Assistant Secretary of State, very promising fellow in the New Deal, and in 1948, another fellow named Whittaker Chambers testifies before the House Un-American Activities Committee that not only was Alger Hiss a communist, but that he was an espionage agent for Joe Stalin's Soviet government. Most people think this is far-fetched. It can't be. Richard Nixon, at first, is one of them. But after listening for a little more to Alger Hiss, things don't add up. He investigates the case. Hiss is ultimately convicted of perjury. Richard Nixon goes on to the United States Senate in 1950 and in 1952 to the vice presidency of the United States. He's 39 years old. He's very young. And he, by 1960, wants to be president of the United States as well. There have been a lot of comparisons between 1960 and 2008. These things start out with primaries, as they often do. 2008, the primaries seem to go on and on and on forever. In 1960, it was very different. The primaries had started during the progressive era before World War I, and over the decades had lost popularity. By 1960, they were kind of at their valley of popularity and of their utility. So in 1960, Richard Nixon faces no primary opposition. Now there's a reason for that. In 2006, the Republican Party took a beating in the congressional races. In 1958, the same thing happened to the GOP. Dwight Eisenhower was president, but this was still basically a Democratic New Deal nation. And in 1958, the GOP had worn out its welcome in House races and Senate races and gubernatorial races, eliminating a lot of potential opposition for the nomination for Richard Nixon in 1960. One fellow whose reputation was made in 1958, though, whose political career started, was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller's. He's governor of New York. He's bold, he's brash, he's energetic, he's very liberal, and he's very wealthy. And he wants to be president in 1960, but the more he campaigns, he finds the less support in the Republican Party, so that by December 1959, he pulls out of the race. And when he does this, what that does is to suck all the air out of the Republican nominating process. It deflects any attention from the Republican race because there is no race. It's much like what happened after John McCain secured the nomination in 2008, very early, and then everyone focuses on the very hotly contested Democratic race. And both John McCain and both Richard Nixon needed the publicity in 1960. So in 1960, all the attention goes in the primary season to the Democratic side of the aisle, and that is really, when we talk about primaries in 1960, we're talking plural, we're talking 2. There are about maybe 8 or 9 officially. Most are beauty contests. Some are not contested, or they're contested by lower ranked guys. The only 2 which amount to anything in 1960 are in Wisconsin and in West Virginia. And there, JFK is out to prove he can be viable as a Catholic nominee, as a young fellow. And he doesn't have to prove it against Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson is Mr. Backroom. He's the deal maker, and he's not going to go into primaries. And in any case, primaries don't count for that much. So he's not going to waste his effort. The fellow wasting his effort or taking his shot against Jack Kennedy in these 2 primaries, which are not New Hampshire or any of those other, or California, but are in Wisconsin and West Virginia, is Hubert Horatio Humphrey, United States Senator from Minnesota, former crusading mayor of Minneapolis. Hubert Humphrey is really, though, not very viable. In national polls in 1960, even though he's going to be the Democratic nominee 8 years from 1960, he's registering a solid 2% in national polls. But when you're the only guy showing up against Jack Kennedy, all of a sudden the race becomes transferred to Jack Kennedy versus Hubert Humphrey, much as in 2008, Barack Obama first emerges as the anti-Hillary candidate, and then Hillary Clinton emerges as the anti-Barack Obama candidate. So in 1960, Hubert Humphrey is the anti-Jack Kennedy candidate, and people of all ideological positions can coalesce around him. Jack Kennedy thinks he's going to win very easily in Wisconsin. He gets surprise, bad polling data, which causes him to campaign in the wrong parts of the state. And Hubert Humphrey turns out to do surprisingly well in Wisconsin, which he was about to give up. He had no money. He had really minimal support organization against the great Kennedy machine and the great Kennedy family. And he decides to go on to West Virginia. And it's actually a good thing for Jack Kennedy that he does, because West Virginia is 97% Protestant. Jack Kennedy's initial poll numbers were very strong in West Virginia, but as more people come to the realization that, gee, this guy is Catholic, his numbers fall like a rock. And it looks like Hubert Humphrey can pull off a great upset and derail Jack Kennedy in the Mountain State. Jack Kennedy, however, responds with a great deal of retail politics. He brings the family into campaign, hits all the hills and hollows of West Virginia, shakes a lot of hands, and faces the Catholic issue head on. Previously, particularly even in Wisconsin, Wisconsin contains the highest percentage of Catholics in the Midwest. And so it was a relatively safe state for him. And when he would address the Catholic issue, either in Massachusetts, again, a very Catholic state, and Wisconsin, somewhat less so, but still significant Catholic population, he's talking to Catholic audiences and saying, don't hold my Catholicism against me. Well, he's not giving the same speech to Protestants until he gets to West Virginia, where he plays on the patriotism of this state, which had sent a huge number of people to fight in World War II per capita and into Korea. Very patriotic. They respected his service in World War II in PT 109. And he says, no one asked my religion or my brother Joe's religion when we went off to fight after Pearl Harbor, and they respect that. And they also pay attention to something else he does during that primary. When, at Joe Kennedy's urging, they bring in Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. to campaign for Jack Kennedy. And Franklin Roosevelt himself was very, very popular in West Virginia. They had built a lot of stuff and helped the people out there. And the New Deal really impacted West Virginians to a great extent. So they bring in Roosevelt, FDR Jr. as the hatchet man. And he brings up Hubert Humphrey's war record in World War II, or lack thereof. And he's basically decried as a draft dodger. And then Jack Kennedy says, well, I wished he hadn't have brought that up. That was just terrible. And I disassociate it's like from the fact that Hubert Humphrey never served in World War II. And one thing leads to another. And also there are allegations of mob involvement in Jack Kennedy's West Virginia campaign, which are open to question, but there was some. And a lot of money is poured into West Virginia. And even though Jack Kennedy is by now very, very nervous about how this election is going to turn out, so nervous that he flies to Washington, D.C., and kind of to hide out, because you want to downplay a defeat. Well, it wasn't that important. I wasn't even there. And he gets the call from Robert Kennedy. You won. You won. And that basically is the end of Hubert Humphrey's campaign and the end of the primaries. That's it. 1, 2, and over. But not the nomination. Where's Lyndon Johnson been? He hasn't been a candidate. He only announces his candidacy for the presidency of the United States 1 week before the Democratic National Convention starts. Now, this doesn't sound like a great strategy nowadays. But it does make more sense back then. In 1952, Adlai Stevenson had captured the Democratic nomination on the third ballot. And in 48, Tom Dewey had captured the GOP nomination on the third ballot. And Wendell Willkie, 1940, on the sixth ballot. Harry Truman nominated for vice presidency in 1944, third ballot. It wasn't, we take it for granted that conventions are going to be cut and dried and you're going to wrap it up on the first ballot. This was not a given in 1960. And Lyndon Johnson is counting on the backroom deal being made, that he can go to his fellow senators and they can go back home and twist some arms, and he will arrive with enough votes in his pocket so that in that second, third, fourth, or fifth ballot, he can derail Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy feels almost the same way. Robert Kennedy says, if we don't win on the first ballot, we don't win at all. It was a very, very closely run thing for Jack Kennedy all the way through 1960, even in those primaries, to the convention, and to the balloting. There are a lot of promises made. They said they would have to rent a very large hall, very much larger than this one, to get all the people that Jack Kennedy promised the vice presidency to that year. Oh yes, you remember Governor Docking of Kansas, don't you? Or Governor Herschel Lovelace of Iowa. Well, they all thought they were going to be vice president, and they weren't. Nor was Orville Friedman of Minnesota. Jack Kennedy, the roll call is held, and by the time it gets to Wyoming, he's over the top. But to show how closely run that was, I mean, there's no states in the roll call that begin with Z. So when you capture it in Wyoming, it was a very, very closely run thing. So then Jack Kennedy, for real, confronts the issue: who is his vice president going to be? Who is going to be the running mate? And as Barack Obama could have chosen the super ticket in 2008 and selected Hillary Clinton, his big rival, and someone who would bring a great demographic edge to the ticket. This was 1960 was a battle of identity politics, as 2008 was. In 2008, will a black man be elected president? Can a black person be elected president? Can a woman be elected president? In 1960, everyone remembers the aspirations of Catholics, that identity politic, but they're forgetting that Lyndon Johnson was facing the same thing. So it was the sectionalism, being a Southerner. No Southerner had been nominated since before the Civil War. Now we take it for granted. We've had Johnson, and we've had Jimmy Carter, we've had Clinton, we've had the two Bushes, and some would say we've had Al Gore elected president. So, but it wasn't a given then. Jack Kennedy said, I had to go to the primaries to prove that a Catholic could be elected. Lyndon Johnson didn't do that. But Lyndon Johnson still had tremendous clout in the South. Jack Kennedy had weaknesses, both because of the Catholic issue and because of the civil rights issue, and because the South was trending back, or for the first time really, to the Republican Party. The solid South had broken loose under the 1952 and 56 elections when Eisenhower took a bunch of states, and it could slide even more under Jack Kennedy. So you had to play nice with Lyndon Johnson if you were Jack Kennedy. But does he? He makes the Joe Biden choice. He takes the safe choice initially. Somebody who maybe can't hurt you, but someone who's not going to help you. He opts to offer the vice presidency in private to a senator from Missouri named Stuart Symington. Symington accepts, but before it's made public, Jack Kennedy's wheels start rolling, and he says, you know, I really should, as a courtesy, offer this to Lyndon. He's not going to take it. He's Senate Majority Leader. He's got immense power. He lives for power. He's not going to be vice president. This is, you know, John Nance Gardner, who was from Texas and been Roosevelt's vice president, said, vice presidency isn't worth a buck of the warm spit. And Lyndon Johnson certainly knew that, and he saw what the realities were. So when Jack Kennedy trundles down the stairs to Lyndon Johnson's suite in the middle of the night to offer him the vice presidency, he is quite shocked when Lyndon Johnson accepts it. And everybody is shocked, and everyone is upset on all sides of the Democratic spectrum. Robert Kennedy, who has always hated Lyndon Johnson and vice versa, is outraged. Kenny O'Donnell, one of Jack Kennedy's closest advisors, says, Jack, you've betrayed every single person that has supported you in your first move as the nominee. And the labor unions are outraged. The Americans for Democratic Action, big liberal group, are outraged. And on Lyndon Johnson's side, his Southern senators, his allies, are just flabbergasted. They don't want to lose their ally, their man in leadership in the Senate, and particularly upset our fellow Texans, Lyndon Johnson's fellow Texans. So everybody's mad. But politics is politics. And Jack Kennedy tells Kenny O'Donnell, Kenny, I'm 43 years old, and I'm not going to die in office. Don't worry. Everybody kisses and makes up. Lyndon Johnson is used to great effect in the South. They really don't know what to do with him in the rest of the country, and he doesn't want to campaign in the rest of the country. But he goes out and is an asset to the Democratic ticket. Richard Nixon decides, for his part, to go for that super ticket option. His inclination is to offer the nomination to Nelson Rockefeller. New York then, where it really was the Empire State, it had 45 electoral votes. It was the biggest state, the biggest prize that way. And Nelson Rockefeller probably could have helped him carry New York. But Nelson Rockefeller's ego is such then that he does not want to take that number 2 slot. He turns him down. At this point, Nixon makes a horrible choice. He selects a fellow named Henry Cabot Lodge, former United States Senator from Massachusetts, then the United States Ambassador to the United Nations to be his running mate. It's kind of like a peace offering still to the Eastern liberal or moderate establishment wing of the Republican Party, and it is a horrendous choice. For one thing, having lost the Senate seat in 1952 to Jack Kennedy, Henry Cabot Lodge has demonstrated irrefutably that he cannot even carry his home state in the general election. He is also a terrible campaigner, unable to inspire crowds, doesn't come across all that well on television, and he's lazy. He's just plain lazy. He will take naps in the afternoon. And the people assigned to shepherd his campaign say, look, we don't mind him taking naps, but does he have to change into his pajamas every day? So this is not a good choice. The campaign goes on, and also he does something which is, he goes off the reservation, Lodge does. And speaking in Harlem, to a group actually, in Spanish Harlem, he makes the announcement that Richard Nixon will have a black member of his cabinet, which is news to Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon responds by kind of fleeing from the thing. And the whole episode has the effect of alienating both Southerners and blacks. It wins for nobody because of the way Nixon has handled it, and the whole thing was done so artlessly. But the civil rights issue is very, very important. And the way that Richard Nixon loses both the white South and the black voting population of the North is very, very key to the election. And one of the keys to how that happens involves Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, as the South had been trending Republican under Eisenhower, the black vote, which had historically been Republican and had gone Democratic starting with Franklin Roosevelt, was coming back to the GOP. In 1956, blacks voted 40% for Dwight Eisenhower. And it looked like it could have, held up that way in 1960. But towards the end, what happens is this. Martin Luther King is moved to Atlanta, Georgia from Alabama. He's arrested in a sit-in at a department store. He goes to jail for the night. It's the first time he spent the night in jail. And he'd be out the next morning or whatever. It's not a big deal, except that not long before that, he'd been pulled over for a moving traffic violation in Georgia. And he'd been released on parole. And when he is arrested for this sit-in, it's a violation of his parole. And the judge in rural Georgia decides, you're going to a prison camp for 6 months for a traffic violation. Now, this is pretty outrageous, and it was also a pretty tough prison camp. And the King family, particularly Coretta Scott King, feared for Martin Luther King's life. It was a question of what would you do? Richard Nixon's black advisors said, can you intervene? Can you make a statement? Can you speak out? And he reacts very legalistically, says you can't interfere with a judge's sentence and all that. Well, there's politics, and there's rights, and there's wrongs, and there's all kinds of things. And often one can hide behind legalisms. And Nixon, again, trying to win both camps, white South, blacks in the North, falls between two stools, doesn't get either. Jack Kennedy is advised to make a phone call, a simple phone call to Coretta Scott King, extending his sympathies. A very human gesture, but one fraught with peril, because it could alienate the South. He does this, and then Robert Kennedy, acting as a go-between really, and Robert Kennedy was very upset with that phone call, but then he is dispatched to be the go-between to that judge, and Martin Luther King is released. The weekend before the election, black neighborhoods in the North are flooded with 45 million pieces of literature alluding to this incident and how the Kennedys helped while Richard Nixon did nothing. And also radio ads on black stations trumpet this message. And Jack Kennedy bumps his percentage of the black vote up. Still not overwhelming. I mean, we think nowadays that it's an automatic. Blacks are going to vote 90, 95% for the Democratic ticket. Back then, not a given. And Nixon, even after this, still manages to hold on to about 30% of the black vote. But it's enough. It's enough in a very, very close eyelash type of election. As 1960 began, the candidate of the television age was not Jack Kennedy. It was Richard Nixon. Why? Because Richard Nixon's candidacy, his political life, had been saved twice by television. In 1952, after he had been charged with having a slush fund and almost thrown off the Republican ticket by Dwight Eisenhower, who he never had a good relationship with. This was one of his problems and one of his great problems in this election. He's saved by his checkers speech, which was the most widely watched TV program for a long time in broadcast history. And then he's saved by a broadcast of or of a debate rather, with Khrushchev, the kitchen debate in Moscow, where he stands up for American free enterprise and against Soviet totalitarianism, and says, you know, your children will live under freedom. Actually, he says that at the convention. But he's the guy who should win the debates in 1960 when they decide to move into a debate format. They never had them before. And how would you structure these things? Well, you could say, you could structure it like Lincoln and Douglas, where you go around the state live and you talk for hours on one topic. But instead they opted for the format we largely have today, which is a series of debates, moderators, wide-ranging follow-up questions. And Jack Kennedy, well, people really didn't know how he could do. He didn't even have that reputation as a great orator. He spoke very fast. His voice would rise to very high levels, a high pitch. How would he do? We didn't know. His record in the Senate was sort of negligible. He had some success with labor racketeering investigations, but he was not, shall we say, the workhorse of the Senate. He had other activities he was pursuing, both political and extracurricular. Now, so the best Nixon has really nothing to gain, except that if he doesn't debate, then that creates another issue, and people say he's afraid. So it seems like he's going to win, and as we know, he didn't. It's really a question of one of the many ironies of the 1960 campaign, where Richard Nixon had always been healthy his whole life, and Jack Kennedy had always been sick. Jack Kennedy had twice been given the last rites of the Catholic Church. He was so ill and so sickly. But in 1960, he's doing pretty well. His Addison's disease is under control. His back isn't too bad. He's okay. Richard Nixon bangs his knee on a car door campaigning in Greensboro, North Carolina. It swells up during the campaign. He's hospitalized. Throws his 50-state strategy of campaigning in all of the 50 states. For the first time, any candidate would do this into a dither. And he has to rush when he gets out of the hospital to maintain his campaign. He's sick. He makes himself sicker. And this is just before the first great debate in Chicago. Kennedy is bronzed, healthy, confident, well-prepared, aggressive. Richard Nixon is sick. He's lost weight. His suit and shirt hang loose upon him. He has certain physical characteristics which are not designed to win a debate. He does not react well to heat, so he sweats a lot. And he shifts his eyes about a great deal. And aside from that, he starts out for the first 20 minutes of this debate in a very cringing way. In the first Obama-McCain debate, Obama was criticized at one point for agreeing like 6 or 7, 8 times with McCain. And that was said to be a sign of weakness. And Richard Nixon took this to extremes in the first part of that first debate with Jack Kennedy. Now, as I said earlier, this was still a democratic nation, and big voter registration edge for the Democratic Party. Jack Kennedy, wherever he spoke, would always emphasize the fact that he was a Democrat. He knew this was a winning pitch to make to people. So he starts out in his opening thing and says, I represent the party of Wilson and Roosevelt and Truman, and we have brought you Social Security and the Tennessee Valley Authority and fought for health care and rural electrification and all these good things. And Mr. Nixon represents Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, the party that brought you the Great Depression. And Howard K. Smith, the moderator, says, no, Mr. Nixon, how do you respond to that? I have no comment. Now, this is basically taking the Fifth Amendment on being a Republican. This is not good. And Nixon pulls himself up from that in the rest of the debate, although his body language is still very poor. And he doesn't wear makeup, so he has that 5 o'clock shadow kind of thing going on, which in Nixon's case was an 8 o'clock shadow. The total effect of the visual effect of Nixon was, as one of JFK's aides said, was like looking like an escaped convict. Think Richard Jansen in the original Fugitive. So he loses, although on radio, a lot of people think he does well. Lyndon Johnson is listening on the radio in Texas in a car, and he thinks Nixon's won. But most people watch on TV, and they think he's lost. Nixon does well in the final 3 debates, but only first debates really count. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression, even though Richard Nixon had been around for a while. The election, that's really one of the defining points of the election. It goes to be a very, very close election. All year, the pollsters do get it right, aside from Jack Kennedy's pollsters in the primaries, when they say it's going to be close, and it is close. In the Electoral College, it is not. But in popular votes, it is. There is the Congressional Quarterly study, which, and because of voting in the South, who was on the ballot in what state, which says that Richard Nixon actually got more popular votes than Jack Kennedy. And even if he didn't, it was incredibly narrow. Only in 6 states does Jack Kennedy get more than 52% of the vote. 4 of those are in New England. 1's Georgia. 1 is New York. New York is only 52%, and these are his landslide states. It goes to the middle of the night. Jack Kennedy goes to bed not knowing whether he's going to win or lose, although before he goes to bed, he gets a call from Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago, who says, Senator, with a little help from your friends in Chicago, you are going to be President of the United States of America. Now, considering the polls have closed, there's not a lot they can do legally at this hour. And between Richard J. Daley and Sam Giancana, who shared a mistress with Jack Kennedy during that campaign, Judith Campbell Exner, who controlled certain wards in the city of Chicago, and Lyndon Johnson's old friends in Texas. The final results of that election were, shall we say, controversial for decades to come. And so Jack Kennedy is awoken the next morning by Ted Sorensen and his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, and told he has won the presidency. And they wait for several hours after that for Richard Nixon's concession. And instead, Robert Finch, press secretary to Nixon, comes out on TV and says, well, it's over. We wish you the best, and that's it. John F. Kennedy just sort of flips off the TV and says, Nixon's going out the same way he came in. No class. So Jack Kennedy has attained his ambition. And ultimately, it will be a question of all 3 ambitions being fulfilled. But be careful what you wish for. Jack Kennedy achieves the presidency, travels to Dallas, and we know what happens there. Lyndon Johnson becomes president of the United States inheriting not only that office from Jack Kennedy, but also a little thing called Vietnam. And he must leave the presidency under a cloud, a very bitter, saddened man, which enables Richard Nixon to make his comeback. And in 1972, when he runs against Hubert Humphrey, or in 1972, after he's beaten Hubert Humphrey in 1968, there's the Watergate break-in, a very mystifying event. Not so much the cover-up being mystifying, but the original motive. And one of the theories is that they're breaking into the offices of Kennedy loyalist Larry O'Brien, now the Democratic National Chairman, to ascertain what he knows about Richard Nixon's connections to Howard Hughes and certain payments of Hughes to Richard Nixon and to B.B. Rebozo. Because O'Brien had worked also for Hughes, worked for Kennedy, obviously was not pulling for Richard Nixon in this campaign. And in the 1960 election, one of those things, and there are a million things you can say swung the election when it's that close. One of them were allegations in a little October surprise towards the end of a loan to the Nixon family, to Donald Nixon, Richard Nixon's brother, for an enterprise he had out in California called Nixon Burgers, from Howard Hughes, a very unsecured sort of loan, which not only helped derail Nixon in 1960, but also when he ran for governor of California in 62. So was it the shadow of 1962 and a race loss there, which caused Richard Nixon's downfall, ultimately? So there you have a question and a case of three ambitions finally realized, hopes and dreams finally destroyed, and three great personal presidential tragedies. Thank you very much. If we have any questions, raise your hand, and then the C-SPAN microphone will seek you out. In the front row.
I have a question. I want to know whether you had seen Frost Nixon yet, number one, what you thought of it. And secondly, there's a scene depicted in there which ostensibly happened before the final day of taping, in which Nixon, lubricated by alcohol, calls Frost at his hotel the night before and kind of engages in a very rambling discussion of how they're similar and how they both had these resentments. And I was wondering if that was licensed or whether you had any information if that was actually a call that had been made.
Well, you are at my advantage. I'm not a great movie person in terms of going out to motion pictures nowadays, but Richard Nixon was certainly lubricated the night he told the press in 1962 that you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. He was really blasted then. But in terms of the bitterness, one thing I really didn't touch on was the Eisenhower-Nixon relationship, where he had been on thin ice all through the 1950s. Not only was he almost dumped from the ticket in 1952, he was almost dumped from the ticket in 56, and Eisenhower offered him a number of other posts if he would leave the vice presidency. And all during that election, Eisenhower stayed away from him. There was a very telling moment at the Republican National Convention in 1960 where Eisenhower flies into Chicago, has a motorcade before 1 million or 2 people. Everyone has a chance to see him and cheer him. And who does he ride in the limousine with? The chairman of the Republican National Committee, Thurston Morton, senator from Kentucky, and Everett McKinley Dirksen. Richard Nixon is waiting for him at the hotel. He doesn't get to ride with him. And even election day, they go in, Eisenhower flies helicopters into Gettysburg to vote. Comes out of the booth. The reporters say, "Who did you vote for?" Eisenhower points to his watch where there are little tiny pictures in the face of the watch of his grandchildren. And he says, "I voted for them." He won't even then say he voted for Nixon. And you could see why Nixon was so insecure, because he was always fighting for his political life. And I think the 1960 election increased that bitterness, and the question of vote stealing in Chicago and Texas. Historians may debate this, but if you're Richard Nixon, you got to be thinking about this all the time, and you say, this is not going to happen to me again, and if this is the way the game is played, I'm going to play it. And he ultimately plays it very badly. Yes? Did you have your hand up?
Yes. You have a very amusing anecdote toward the end of the book about Richard Nixon on Election Day 1960. Would you care to share that with us?
Yes. Richard Nixon is, of course, the ultimate control freak, the button-down candidate, the man who's running everything himself, and not exactly a free spirit. But on election day, he goes off to vote in a little tract house in California, and then gets in the car, goes to see his mother and such. And at some point, just kind of he instructs the driver to pull over. And the driver is pulled out of the car. Nixon gets in behind the wheel and speeds off. He ditches the press, he ditches his entourage. He's got two guys with him, his military attaché and a Los Angeles police sergeant, okay? Imagine with like Joe Friday in the back seat, okay? And he just wants to get away from everything. And he starts driving south from Orange County, and south, and south. And Bob Finch, his press secretary, doesn't know. No one knows where he is. So the reporter said, "Where's the vice president?" "Well, he likes to go for a run. We know where he is." Finch has no idea where he is. He stops for gas, and they keep going down. And somebody in the car says, "Yes, Mr. Vice President, we're almost in Tijuana." "Tijuana? I haven't been there in 20 years. You ever been there?" "No." "Let's go." So election day, the leader of the free world is like, heading for Tijuana, and he asks at the border, "Where's a good place to get some Mexican food?" And they tell him, "Old Heidelberg." So Nixon spends his lunchtime at Old Heidelberg in Tijuana getting Mexican food, having some cerveza. Then he heads back across the border, and the people at customs are like asking the usual customs questions, and they're asking him, "You're all citizens?" And Nixon says, "I am, but I don't know about the fellow in the back." And he keeps driving north finally, and he gets to near San Juan Capistrano, and he goes, "This is one of my favorite Catholic places. Let's stop." And he goes, and this is 1960, first Catholic president elected. Which candidate spends part of the day in the Catholic Church? Richard Nixon. Nuns are waving to him, whatever. Anyway, so that was Richard Nixon's excellent adventure, Election Day, 1960. So, any other questions? Yes.
I'd like to know your opinion on the future of the National Political Convention in the light of everything being a done deal. Do you think they're on the verge of becoming obsolete, or is it just too big of a commercial for the parties not to put on? There's no drama anymore.
Well, I guess I'll preface whatever answer I managed to come up with by saying I'm a historian, not a prophet. So it's always dangerous to predict. History does help you give some perspective. It really helps you analyze things after they've happened. But we almost saw a brokered convention this year. I mean, it didn't happen. But if the superdelegates had broken the other way, or if they had not if they had just split, I mean, it could have been a first ballot or second ballot thing. You could have had some tremendous tension, but you haven't. The whole, if you get a field which is so fractured, and if the if the thing is not strung, it's now a very compact primary situation, so that you get like McCain wrapping things up very quickly. But if things stretch out and you do have a fractured convention, and you do have 4 or 5, no front runner emerges, then you can have an interesting convention. Or you could have a big fight over platforms, such as 1948 in the civil rights plank with the Democrats, or the Democrats in 1968. You can get some drama even in the 1960 convention. There was some drama over the platform, and Richard Nixon had flown to New York to kind of keep Nelson Rockefeller on board, which ticked off the conservatives, which led to an abortive nomination for Barry Goldwater that year, and ultimately helped him win the nomination in '64 and tilt the whole direction of the Republican Party to this day. So you never know where these things will, even though they seem dull. One of the advantages I had in this book over Theodore White, who did The Making of the President, is I've got 40, 50 years of being able to see what turned out. He didn't have that advantage. He couldn't know the significance of Goldwater at the Republican convention, or Eugene McCarthy at the Democratic, or that Hubert Humphrey would turn out to be this, or that all 3 men would turn out to be presidents. He just didn't know. So the answer is, who knows? Yes?
You present a very balanced book. So what I'm going to ask you is not in the book, which makes me think it never happened. But I'm going to ask anyway. The theory has always been, and Nixon says it in his book, Six Crises, that he did not challenge the election in Illinois because of his magnanimous nature. Magnanimous nature and Richard Nixon are not synonymous. I was always told that the reason he did not challenge Chicago's votes is he was approached by the downstate Republicans, told, don't open that box. We may have been out-cheated. And it's not a question of magnanimous, but it's just don't go near it, let it go. And he doesn't address that, and you don't address it, which makes me wonder if it ever happened.
I think I think one of the things that, not so much magnanimity, but that he realized that the mechanisms weren't there to effectively challenge these things. And we see, it's like, I mean, what's going on in Minnesota? How long does it take to count these things? And I'm not sure, did they, there was a state Senate election in Queens they were counting until like last week. I mean, so particularly in a statewide thing where the stakes are so high and these recount mechanisms were not in place and could have, tied up the presidency forever. Who knows? I would just hazard a guess that Chicago Republicans or Democrats are better at stealing votes than downstate Illinois Republicans, and there are probably more votes to steal. Now this theory is spreading that, and I think it's apocryphal, that somebody said to Nixon, don't challenge Illinois because we stole Kentucky. I'm not sure where that comes from. And you never see, one of the things I worry about is as a historian is, if you see something like that and it's almost like a throwaway line and you don't see any documentation for it, whereas you do see, now the thing about Chicago is that the interesting thing about vote fraud in Chicago in 1960 to me was that the allegations of it and the investigations of it were beginning in October. That the stories were appearing in the Chicago Tribune, admittedly a Republican paper, that Daley was really gearing up to steal the election that year. Not for Jack Kennedy, but there was a local grudge match where the state's attorney was, like the district attorney of Cook County, was up for re-election. He was a former Democrat, former Daley ally, and he wanted to get this guy big time. He wanted him out, and he wanted the governorship and all that other stuff. And if you could steal the presidency in the bargain, well, so much the better. So that was already, and then there's a Texas thing. One of those little things about Texas and Illinois is this. Every mistake a losing candidate makes gets magnified, and everything that a winning candidate or military campaigner does tends to be not important because you won. So when the Allies land on the wrong beach in Normandy, well, that's not important because you win, okay? And Nixon in the last week of the campaign flies out to Alaska to keep that 50-state pledge, and all historians go, that's the dumbest thing. That's like, why is he doing this? And aside from keeping his word, which is like something you don't associate with Richard Nixon, but it's like, okay. Jack Kennedy's doing this, having the same problem. He wants to be in California, and he's stuck by his campaign people in New England, which is stupid. If Alaska had been projected for the Democrats, Richard Nixon takes it. Now, if he doesn't lose, or if he doesn't take Alaska, and he takes Illinois and Texas, say there's no fraud, and he doesn't get Alaska's 3 electoral votes, he loses in the Electoral College by 1 vote. So the wheels are always turning in Richard Nixon's head. Anyway, I think that's about it for our time frame. I thank you all very much for coming and for some great questions and for a warm response. Thank you very much.